Hello, everyone. In this video lecture, I'm going to discuss some of the underpinnings of philosophy, particularly that of Rene Descartes and one of his most famous axioms, in order to set context for Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. In the original version of this story, when it was first published, each of the delineations between sections in the text was noted with a computer punch code or type code readout that would translate when fed through the appropriate machine in order to translate the punch code into English or into another language. It would read either I think, therefore I am, or in other sections of the text, cogito ergo sum. So each smaller subsection of the text, whenever there's a break in time or a skip forward in time, you would have the sections denoted, or those divisions denoted, by one of these two images that would appear inside the text. Harlan Ellison is alluding to the philosophy of Rene Descartes and his axiomatic assertion, I think, therefore I am, or in the original, cogito ergo sum. You can see on the third page of the story that there's a direct reference to Descartes. Benny asks, what does am mean? Gorister answered him, we had done this sequence 1,000 times before, but it was Benny's favorite story. At first it meant allied master computer, and then it meant adaptive manipulator, and later on it developed sentience and linked itself up, and they called it an aggressive menace. And finally, it called itself AM, emerging intelligence, and what it meant was I am. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. In order to understand how the story engages with what is obviously a key philosophical intertext, I'm going to just introduce you to a very general, bare bones, and broad summary of some of Rene Descartes' philosophy and this axiom for which he is most well recognized. Now, I've referred to this term axiom a few times. Philosophically, or in any kind of science, an axiom is defined as an assumption that is taken to be true without proof, as it is self-evident, or that cannot be proven. You may like to think, and we do indeed like to think, that as rational people, as skeptical people perhaps even, we, as a civilization or as individuals, eschew belief of any kind. So if you are in a scientific field, or if you adhere to the tenets of scientism, which holds that all knowledge claims and all truth claims are ultimately derived by way of scientific inquiry, or that science is the basis for all true knowledge, which obviously is a self-defeating assertion, given that that truth that is being expressed, if it is a truth, is not scientifically or empirically derived. Nonetheless, if you hold to that kind of claim, we oftentimes in contemporary society like to perceive ourselves as holding truths or believing things or holding things as true that are not predicated on belief or assumption. That is, that we have rational justification for whatever it is that we believe. Obviously, everyone is going to want to have rational justification for what they believe. However, every belief in turn cannot be justified. In other words, let's say you have a web of various different beliefs that are all interconnected. So you have at the core of your basis of beliefs, let's say, the assertion that the world outside of you exists. That's a belief. You're assuming that. Let's say that you believe that. From that, then, you can judge various different empirical experiments, like weighing or measuring things, conducting experiments on a drop of oil in the milligram experiment to determine the mass of an electron or the like. In those cases, when you're running a scientific experiment, you are relying on assumptions regarding the nature of the universe, the repeatability of your experiments, the consistency of experiments over time. That is, that running an experiment will allow for the application of inductive reasoning such that what has transpired in the past is actually indicative in terms of like natural laws and how gravity works or how mass functions is indicative of what will transpire in the future. That you can extrapolate truths about the universe based on past experience. All of those assumptions undergird then any scientific knowledge that you develop. Even though we like to believe that we don't really believe anything, we only accept as true what is proved. Let's say we have this radical skepticism. Ultimately, you're always going to come down to beliefs that can't be proven. You can't have an infinite regression of proved beliefs. For instance, if I was to ask you about some belief that you hold, let's say belief X, just as a label, and I asked you to justify that belief, you would then provide some kind of explanation to justify that belief. Then, let's say I ask you again, your justification why is also a belief. Obviously, it has to be. You believe something or accept something as true in order to support your next level of belief. So I could take you back, belief by belief by belief, assertion by assertion, and ask you why, like a child. Well, why do you believe X is true? You give me explanation why. And I ask you, well, why do you believe that Y is true? And then you give me the explanation Z, because Z is true. And then I ask you, well, why do you believe that Z is true? Inevitably, you cannot justify the grounding for your belief because there can't be an infinite regress. Eventually, you have to hit upon some kind of assertion or truth or belief that is unjustified. It's something that is epistemically, that is, it is pertaining to the field of knowledge, it's epistemically justified or warranted to believe without proof. These epistemically warranted beliefs that we take without proof, that we accept as given, are oftentimes axiomatic. That is, they're so self-evidently true that we accept them without proof, or we recognize that they can't be proven, and thus we accept them and use them as the basis for every other belief that we stack on top of it. As an example, in philosophy, you have the law of non-contradiction. Something cannot be and not be at the same time. Or if A equals B and A equals C, then B equals C. That transitive property of agreement, of non-contradiction in essence, is axiomatic. It's definitional. There's a law of logic that you accept but can't be proven. There's no kind of experimental process or procedure that you could undertake to prove that law of non-contradiction. It transcends physicality. It transcends the empirical world. And in fact, if there was no physical world in a hypothetical scenario, if nothing physical existed, that law would still exist. It would still be a reality and an axiomatic reality. Logically, that would be true because it transcends physicality. It's a logical truism. And logic, just like math, seems to transcend the physical world, arguably. Mathematical concepts are numbers. Even if there was no object in the universe, it would still be possible for the number 2 itself to exist. It describes something in the universe, it correlates with something in the universe, but its existence transcends that universe itself. Axioms, in a sense, oftentimes in philosophy, operate the same way. The law of non-contradiction and logical truths or logical facts are self-evidently true or are assumed to be true as the basis of any philosophical system that is built upon them. The same is true for mathematics. And given that mathematics and philosophy are so similar in terms of the formal logic that is employed in their development and the articulation of ideas, you can actually reduce logical propositions to the form of mathematical arguments or notation that is remarkably similar to mathematics. Are such things as it's possible to draw a straight line from any point to any other point, or it's possible to extend a line segment continuously in both directions. I can't empirically, physically measure that. I can't see the two ends of an infinite line to prove that it can be created. Or two parallel lines will never meet. That's axiomatic of Euclidean geometry. When I accept that maxim, or when I accept that axiom, then everything else, every other proof and development of mathematics, or at least classical mathematics, can be derived from that set of truths, or that set of assumptions. Every set of beliefs ultimately boils down to axioms, things that we have taken to be true without proof because you can't have an infinite regression of proofs. That definition of axiom brings us to Rene Descartes, and it allows us to understand some of what his project was as a philosopher. Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician who is famous in part for developing the Cartesian coordinate system that we are familiar with in much of our mathematics and physics. Now, Descartes himself and his philosophy, and at least his approach to philosophy, was very much embedded in his particular historical moment, as he was a product of, in essence, Renaissance humanism. During the Renaissance, and this is a gross oversimplification of centuries worth of development and the evolution of thought, the relationship between church, state, government, faith, reason, the developing sort of quasi-scientific understanding of the world, or the methodological approaches that were adopted into the scientific method as we understand it today. Gross oversimplification. But in broad terms, he was a product of Renaissance humanism. In that, at this point in time, with the Protestant Reformation, the fracturing of church authority in many nations, and the scientific revolution, you have a new kind of philosophy and a new series of perceptions or perspectives on the world that are arising out of skepticism, in a sense. That is, an unwillingness to accept received truths from the past and to call into question anything, or a willingness to call into question received truths. So, looking back at the philosophical systems of past ages, is there some way, perhaps, that we can break them down and construct new perceptions of the world and new philosophical systems? At this point in time, you have a burgeoning sense of individuality, independence from broader social structures and power systems. And as a result of this kind of destabilization of those structures of knowledge, understanding, and religious belief, you had the emergence of new modes of thinking. Within this context, Descartes could be viewed as a predecessor to the rationalists. Now, rationalists believe, or rationalism holds, that human reason itself, rather than any kind of like authority, the structure that's put in the world, rather than received knowledge, rather than God or divine revelation, is the true source and the means by which we test knowledge. Rationalists would appeal to reason itself as the source of knowledge and the justification for true belief. In contrast, let's say an empiricist would believe that our basis for knowledge is what we can observe in the world, and let's say in our context, the experiments that we could carry out. Repeatability, observation, these are the things that we garner, or from whence we garner information about the world and true knowledge or true beliefs. So you have something that's grounded perfectly in the world and observation of the world in terms of empiricism, and you have the rationalists who believe that everything proceeds from the human intellect. There's an elevation and a celebration of the human intellect, the reason and our capacity to gain knowledge by way of contemplation and reflection. That, or both of those evolving elements of the Renaissance period, the scientific revolution, that come together really in our modern conceptions of science and how we employ them, are set against previously understood means of deriving knowledge by way, in part, of reception, tradition, and divine revelation, and an understanding of that revelation. Now, whether either of those two positions are themselves justified, whether they are consistent within their own systems, and whether or not they're operating on those unproven axioms is really a matter for debate. Although we accept rationalism and empiricism as being largely the foundations for our own understanding of the universe, and much of the technological and sociological developments that we have had, that we put into place, their groundwork can indeed be called into question and may be very much suspect. For instance, the rationalist is operating on the belief that his reason is not fundamentally compromised. An evolutionary biological understanding of the world, in fact, calls that into question. After all, our rational faculties, our intelligence, and our brains in an evolutionary understanding of the world are merely the product of evolution. Our brains, our minds, and our rational faculties were not designed in some way as to arrive at truth. No, evolution, according to the dictates of evolution and survivability, refined our minds, our intellects, our reasons, and the way in which we perceive and conceptualize the world, and thus grapple with it and understand it, in such a way as to ensure our survival, or so as to ensure the propagation of our genes. That's what evolution does, in Dr. Moreau's words. However, that doesn't mean that our intelligence is oriented towards truth. All it means is that it's oriented towards survival. So, if the human mind evolved in such a way as to convince us or to be predisposed to convince us of things that weren't true. But those untruths, those lies, those things that the very structures of our minds convinced us were true or led us to believe were true, contributed to our survival, then we would believe them. Our reason wouldn't be oriented towards truth. Our reason would be oriented towards survival. Yeah. Our reason or our rational faculties can't really be trusted because, by definition, by their very nature, they're not oriented towards truth, they're oriented towards survival. And if it increases our individual or our collective capacity to survive, to believe things that aren't true, or for our reason to betray us or lead us in inaccurate and incorrect directions in order to accept things that are untrue, that will contribute to our survival, our reason will do that based on the presumptions of a secularist or a worldview in which we're not created beings, we're not endowed with rational faculties by a creator, we're not mirroring that creator, we are just products of evolution. So there are fundamental assumptions in the rationalist project about reason being oriented towards truth. That in and of itself is an axiom that the rationalists can't justify. They don't have the preconditions to really ground their own rationalistic project. That's a gross oversimplification of a critique of rationalism, but it's just introducing the idea of axioms and applying them to various different philosophical systems. Broad terms. People could obviously disagree with me about that, and good, yes, there are arguments on either side as to the grounding for rationalism or empiricism. But the point is about axioms and the broad definition of rationalism and empiricism. Empiricism, of course, operates in much the same way. If you're deriving all of your truth claims and knowledge claims about the world from empirical observations, you're relying on the legitimacy or the validity of your sense impressions of the world. You're accepting that what I weigh with my hands and touch, what I smell, what I see, all of these things are accurate reflections of that external world. And you're also choosing to believe that the external world has rational grounding, or that there's an objective existence to the external world. Likewise, that what is being conveyed through our senses to our brains is accurate. And that you have a precondition for the intelligibility of the universe in the form of the principle of induction. In other words, that if I run an experiment at one point in one part of the galaxy, that the results that derive from that experiment are going to apply in a completely different context on the other side of the galaxy. And that the laws of nature that allowed for that experiment that I carried out at one point, let's say measuring something or weighing something, that the laws of nature in one part of the universe and at one time are also going to inductively apply at some other point and in some other time. Those are assumptions, all of them, that undergird empiricism, that may or may not be justified. But oftentimes we don't even think about them. I don't wonder whether I have justification to believe that my senses are not lying to me. I don't wonder whether 1 kilogram weight is the same mass in the Milky Way galaxy as it is in some distant galaxy on the other side of the universe. I don't ask those questions. I just assume that the answer to them, that yes, they will weigh the same or they will have the same mass at different times and in different places. Now, we're getting into two parts of Descartes' philosophy that are going to be germane to am and this story. I already mentioned Descartes' famous assertion, I think, therefore I am. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the first point that is relevant to us is that Descartes developed a systematic understanding of animals and men by which to distinguish them. So you can think back to the Eye of Dr. Moreau, which we have just studied, and the dividing line between animal and man and how that becomes blurred. For Descartes, animals were biological machines. In other words, they had no real animating principle, no spirit, nothing immaterial to them. Descartes did, as a religious man, believe in God and some kind of animating non-physical or non-material spirit. Animals, however, were not possessed of such a spirit or soul. They were really just clockwork, biological clockwork. So electrical impulses, blood corpuscles, all the various different physical structures led to mechanistic processes that operated animals. Animals were really just like clocks that walked around that were highly complex. One gear inside a clock turns the other. In an animal, one neuron fires and it leads off to another series of neurons firing. It goes into the muscles with the nerve fibers. All of this complex machinery of the animal is driven by instinct and the physical nature of the creature. There is nothing non-physical about an animal. Human beings, he said, are different in that we have an indwelt, immaterial, animating spirit, that which gives us life, or that which takes the body from being just a machine of flesh and makes it something more than that, that gives us will and independent thought and self-consciousness, our ability, that inner life that we talked about in relation to the thing. That which gives us consciousness is really that indwelling spirit that animates the body. So human beings and animals are distinguished by, one, animals being just biological machines, and human beings, on the other hand, being biological machines, however, that are possessed and driven by, operated by, that are used as a machine, a tool by the spirit, or this animating principle. As we look at I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, we'll delve more deeply into the application of this distinction and tease out some of the ways in which Harlan Ellison is appropriating it. I am going to conclude this video lecture here. In the next video lecture, we're going to actually take that idea of cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, and explore its implications and how Descartes develops it, or his project, that is going to be so central to the definition of am, the mechanical monster in this text. Now that we have all this background information about philosophy, axioms, and Descartes himself.